Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Randy Beck, and I would like to thank you for joining us for these videos on dementia. Now, this video was originally recorded for the Insane Gratitude Forever Foundation, which is a foundation that I have become associated with, and the goals of the Foundation, Insane Gratitude Foundation, is to empower individuals, families, and caregivers with the knowledge and tools needed to understand, prevent, and manage dementia. Now, all of the stuff that we have on all the courses and everything that we have on the website are free. So we have courses, we have educational videos, podcast interviews with experts, and I would really recommend that you come and join us for the podcast. So the Insane Gratitude Podcast, we have a lot of fun, but we also present a lot of meaningful information that you may not be able to find anywhere else. So hopefully you join us. I'll put the link in the comments below. So all you have to do after the video, if you want to join us, go click on the link, come over to the insanegratitude.com website, and check it out. See if our podcasts are up yet. We're going to be posting those podcasts over the next few weeks or so. Okay, well, without further ado, we'll get to the video, and hopefully this helps you understand dementia a little better. Okay, bye for now. See you on the insanegratitude.com website. Join us for the podcast. It's going to be very entertaining, I think. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our video series on dementias associated with aging and neurodegeneration. This particular video will be focused on Alzheimer's disease. And you'll see me up here in the right corner as we take you through this presentation. Okay, thank you very much again. I'm excited you're here, and hopefully you learned something from this. Please check out our podcast, where we talk about a lot of these topics in much more detail. Okay, thank you. Without further ado, we'll get started. Okay, so we're focusing obviously on dementia here. So dementia is composed of various disorders and factors which contribute to dementia, resulting in progressive and irreversible loss of neurons and brain function. Now, dementia is basically the loss of cognitive functioning. And cognitive functioning is the ability to think, to remember, or reason, and it has to be lost to such an extent that it starts to interfere with the person's daily life and activities. Now, these functions can include things like memory, language skills, visual perception, problem solving, self-management, and the ability to focus and pay attention. Now, these certain types of dementia, like Alzheimer's, can progress to actually cause death, actually, if they get progressed to the nth degree. Okay, excellent. Now, Alzheimer's disease is probably it is the most common dementia, especially in older adults. As many as 5 million Americans aged 65 and older may have the disease. Now, in most neurodegenerative diseases, certain proteins abnormally clump together and are thought to damage healthy neurons, causing them to stop functioning and to die. In Alzheimer's disease, fragments of a protein called amyloid form abnormal clusters called plaques, which occur between the cells, and a protein called tau forms tangles inside the actual neurons. So the tau is a protein that forms inside the neurons, and then some of that tau breaks down and forms these amyloids, which occur outside of the cell. So the amyloid plaques are here, the tau occurs inside the actual neuron. Now, these amyloid plaques are known as beta amyloid protein, which in Alzheimer's are formed from the breakdown of a larger protein called amyloid, as I mentioned before. Now, it comes in several different molecular forms that collect between neurons. The beta amyloid 42 is thought to be especially toxic in the Alzheimer's brain. Abnormal levels of this naturally occurring protein start to clump together to form plaques, and these start to eventually disrupt cell function. So you can see here in this little picture, this is the healthy cells, and you can see it's very clear between the neurons. These are neurons, and then the area between the neurons is basically cytoplasm. Now, these little sort of browny gray things are these big amyloid plaques that are starting to form outside of the neuron bodies. Now, there's a complex interplay between the tau, which is inside the protein, and the beta amyloid, which is outside the protein. So the abnormal tau and beta amyloid proteins and several other factors, which we'll get to in some other slides. It appears to be that abnormal tau accumulates in specific brain regions, generally in the beginning, which involve memory. And then the beta amyloid clumps into plaques between the neurons. As levels of beta amyloid reach a tipping point, there seems to be a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. So not just in the memory producing neurons, but it starts to spread throughout the whole brain. Now, the microtubules, so this tau protein, basically holds together the normal microtubules inside a neuron. And the microtubules are used to transport things like neurotransmitter components and things like that throughout the neuron. So the microtubules are held together by this tau protein. And that tau protein, when it is not normal and it breaks away from the microtubules and starts to form little tangles inside the neuron, these are those neurofilamentary tangles that start to happen, which are impeding the flow through the microtubules. So that starts to actually cause problems in the metabolism inside the neurons, and then the neurons start to die. So these are the neurofibrillary tangles that I talked about. So basically, here we see the normal healthy microtubule, which is held together by these tau proteins. And then for some reason in Alzheimer's, these microtubules or the tau proteins become unstable and they disconnect from the microtubules, and then they form these little tangles, which start, because the microtubules are no longer held together and they can't move stuff around the neuron starts to die. Now, healthy neurons are supported basically, as I said before, internally by these structures called microtubules, which help guide the nutrients and molecules from the cell body through the axons and dendrites in healthy neurons. And tau normally binds and stabilizes these microtubules, as I stated before. In Alzheimer's disease, they become, there's abnormal chemical changes that start to happen to the microtubules, and they start to stick together to other tau molecules, and they form tangles inside the neuron. And these, as I said, these tangles block the neuron's transport system, which harms the synaptic communication between neurons, and that starts to break down the ability of the brain to communicate. And as that ability of the brain breaks down to communicate between neurons and between networks, the ability to function also starts to reduce. And then that creates a whole cascade of other events, which results in the death of neurons and other components of the nervous system. Now, it seems like the damage to the brain starts a decade or more before memory and other cognitive problems start to appear. So the damage often initially appears in the area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that's essential to forming memories. Ultimately, the plaques and the tangles spread throughout the whole brain, and then the brain tissue, as it starts to lose function and neurons, starts to shrink. So this little diagram points out various components of the brain, which we will mention as we go through. Now, the hippocampus is this area here. Now, this hippocampus we've just mentioned is an area where memories are started, where short-term memory starts to form. And all of these structures here are all part of the limbic system. So the hippocampus, the fornix here, which curves around and ends by the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is part of the brain that activates when we are afraid, or we should be afraid. And so it tells us when something bad is going to happen. So we need to be ready, we need to be prepared. And there's also this cingulate cortex that comes around here, the cingulate gyrus. And this cingulate can be thought of as connecting the thinking brain to the emotional brain. And so this is these areas of the brain are very important. And it's interesting that the Alzheimer's disease starts in the area of memory, which is an area in the hippocampus which is very plastic in nature. And we don't know whether that plasticity, ability to be plastic, is contributing to why the Alzheimer's starts there or not. But that's an interesting road to investigate. Now, let's look at what some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease are. As Alzheimer's disease progresses, people start experiencing greater memory loss and other cognitive deficiencies or difficulties. Problems obviously can include things like wandering, getting lost, trouble handling money. So it's aspects of daily living that start to be affected at this point. They start repeating questions, they start taking longer to complete daily tasks, and the personality and behavioral changes may also become apparent at this point. So we have the memory, the reasoning, the language, and the coordination starts to go as other parts of the brain start to get involved. Mood starts to go as other parts of the brain, and behavior starts to go as other parts of the brain start becoming involved. And this is showing a spreading throughout brain areas, which is very concerning. And this basically is the point at which people are often diagnosed with Alzheimer's at this age, or at this point. So we got memory loss and confusion starts to worsen. People begin to have problems recognizing family and friends. They're unable to learn new things. They carry out multiple step tasks, such as getting dressed. They cope and they have trouble carrying out multiple step tasks, such as getting dressed or coping with new situations. In addition, people at this stage may have hallucinations. They start maybe having some delusions, paranoia, may even behave impulsively. Now, what kind of tests can be done? Interestingly enough, probably around before the year sort of 2000, the only way we could diagnose Alzheimer's disease was after the person had actually passed away, and then we do an autopsy and we looked at the brain. Now we have different tests that we can do. So we can do a structural MRI. This assesses cortical atrophy, or how much of the brain has actually started to deteriorate or die. Now, the advantages of this is it's widely available and it's non-invasive. So the MRI, you don't have to cut anybody open or anything. But it's less sensitive, especially in the early Alzheimer's disease situation. And it can be influenced by other comorbidities that can occur so that the ability for it to diagnose is not as sensitive as some of the other tests. Now, we also have this PET scan, the FDG PET scan, which evaluates brain metabolism, and it has potential to detect functional brain change earlier than atrophy. But the downsides are it's very costly, it has limited access, and it requires radiation. So you have to use radiation to get these tests. Now, there's also this amyloid PET scan, which can detect amyloid deposition, and we've talked about what the amyloid does inside, or why it occurs inside the brain. Now, it's got high specificity for the amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's disease. The problem is it's also very costly, it requires radiation, and there's limited sort of studies to show how effective it is actually to tell us about what stage someone is at in Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's also the cerebral spinal fluid analysis, which measures the amount of this beta amyloid and tau levels. So these are the protein levels that are being produced in excess amounts in Alzheimer's disease. And it's a direct measurement of pathological markers. So downsides are it's an invasive procedure because it involves doing a lumbar puncture. So it involves putting a needle into the cerebrospinal fluid around the spinal cord. Now we also have plasma biomarkers that we can use, which measures again the AB and the tau levels. Some other components that we can look at that are also released when these proteins are increased in a huge abundant amounts. So it's minimally invasive, it's cost effective, it has potential for population screening. Now there's an under-validation of this type of test. It's got low specificity compared to the CFS and CFS biomarkers. So it's not really that specific for Alzheimer's disease, or as specific as we would like it. So these are some of the tests that are available now that you can help get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Now, in late stage Alzheimer's disease, so we've been talking about people with the disease sometimes cannot communicate because they start to lose a lot of the functions of the brain. They may become dependent on someone else for care. The person may be in bed most or all of the time, and some bodily functions start to shut down as the brain starts to deteriorate. Now, certain drugs can temporarily slow some of the symptoms of Alzheimer's from getting worse, but there are currently no medical treatments or drugs that stop the progression of the disease completely. And we'll talk more very soon in this discussion about some of the drugs and what they do and what they try to do, what the concept behind the drugs are. So you can see here, this is a sort of normal brain, and this is what the brain starts to look like as the Alzheimer's starts to progress. And you can see that the gray area of the brain starts to reduce. The gray area is the area that has the neurons in it, and the white area, or the white areas of the brain, are the areas that have the axons that form from those cells. Now, I think the axons stay relatively intact, even though the nerve cell bodies start to deteriorate and the connections between the neurons start to deteriorate. So that's why we start losing gray area of the brain. Okay, so let's talk about some of the medications that can manage. Now, there's basically a few approaches that the medications take. So this first, brexpiprazole, is basically an antipsychotic. Now, this is used to treat the agitation that starts to result from Alzheimer's. As people start to realize that their brain isn't functioning right, they start maybe to develop some paranoia or some agitation. And so this antipsychotic tends to calm that down a bit. So this isn't really, any kind of a drug that's going to stop the progression of the Alzheimer's, but it is something to help manage the symptoms. Now, we also have this donepezil, which is a cholinesterase inhibitor. Now, cholinesterase is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. So the concept behind this drug is that acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter inside the brain. And because the neurofibrillary tangles start to interrupt the neuron's ability to transport neurotransmitter and use neurotransmitter, that acetylcholine production starts to reduce, so that when the neurons do release it, they don't release as much. So this cholinesterase inhibitor causes that enzyme that breaks that neuron down to not work as well. So that neurotransmitter will stay around longer, and so enhance the little neurotransmitter that's released. It'll stay around longer, so it'll enhance transmission. That's the concept. Now, it's the same as this galantamine. Galantamine is also a cholinesterase inhibitor. Same actual approach, but this has a larger domain of activity, which also involves the nicotinic receptors. So there's a muscarinic receptor and a nicotinic receptor, and this one involves both. So the acetylcholine can be effective in both the nicotinic and the muscarinic receptors for a longer time. Side effects of these drugs include things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, decreased appetite, weight loss, dizziness, and headaches. Now the next sort of class of drug is called this NMDA antagonist. So this treats symptoms that are of moderate to severe Alzheimer's by blocking the toxic effects associated with excess glutamate production, which usually when we have an excess in glutamate activation, one of the side effects of that can actually be cell death, which is one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's. So if we reduced that glutamate activation, we can potentially stop the progression of the Alzheimer's. Now, the side effects of this include dizziness, headaches, diarrhea, constipation, and confusion. There's also 2 drugs that are aimed at actually modifying the disease progression, and they are lecanemab and donanemab. And these are basically drugs that are there to reduce the number of plaques that are building in the brain. So they start to either break up the plaques or stop the plaques from forming as fast as they have been forming. Now, the possible side effects include vomiting, fevers, chills, body aches, fatigue, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, and low oxygen. So there's a lot of side effects to these drugs. However, if it can start to slow down the progression of the disease. Now, there's a bit of controversy of how much they actually slow down the disease. Some estimates are that it might buy you 4 or 5 months of longer activity before things will deteriorate to the point that these drugs either won't help or it's too far gone and the disease will continue to progress. So what are the causes of Alzheimer's disease? That's something that we want to look at. Now, there's basically a variety of factors, and we'll talk about a few of these in more detail as we progress through the lecture or progress through the presentation. Now, the first one is age, basically. So the older you get, the more likely you are to get Alzheimer's. Now, that doesn't mean everyone who ages gets Alzheimer's. It just means age is one of the predominant risk factors for Alzheimer's. Now, there are also genetic factors, which we're going to discuss in more detail further on in the discussion. There are certain types of infections that can accelerate the development of Alzheimer's. Basically, infections that cause a neuron damage are going to make those neurons more susceptible to the types of things that happen in Alzheimer's. There's also environmental factors like heavy metals and things like that could contribute to the development of neuron loss, which would again result in the progression of Alzheimer's or the development of Alzheimer's. Other things including sort of lifestyle things like obesity, diabetes, other lifestyle stuff like lack of exercise. So if you increase your exercise, you can increase the oxygenation and blood flow in your brain, which tends to reduce the occurrence of Alzheimer's. And we also have cardiovascular disease, because it causes a reduction in blood flow, reduction in other kinds of nutrients that the brain needs, can result in the propensity to form Alzheimer's disease. Also, repetitive head injuries can also result in the increased occurrence of Alzheimer's disease. So again, things that damage your neurons tend to increase the propensity or increase the probability that you'll develop Alzheimer's disease. So chronic inflammation, this is one of the reasons that repetitive head injuries and things like that may contribute to Alzheimer's development. So chronic inflammation can basically be caused by the buildup and harmful secretions of malfunctioning glial cells. Now, the glial cells are the cells that are in the brain that are not neurons. They're other types of cells that help the neurons work. So one of those types of glial cells is called microglia. And the microglia are like the immune system of the nervous system or of the brain. And they go around and they pick up stuff, garbage, waste products, that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we think is happening is that when the microglia start to malfunction, that's when these beta amyloid plaques start to form inside the neurons. And that's when you get that's when you start getting the buildup of the neurofibrillary tangles, the tau proteins, breakdown of the microtubules, loss of synaptic function due to the loss of neurotransmitters and other nutrients that are transferred through these microtubules that the neurons need to survive. And then you get, when you get synaptic loss, then you get loss of neuron function. And when you get loss of neuron function, then you start to get cell death, neuron death. That leads to cognitive impairment because you don't have activation of enough neurons to carry out the function of cognition. Now, also vascular issues can result in the development of Alzheimer's. So again, anything that reduces nutrient delivery, oxygen delivery, or the removal of waste products from the brain can result in an increased probability of developing Alzheimer's. So basically problems that affect blood vessels, even things like the beta amyloid deposits in brain arteries. So that's something we haven't really discussed. Is these amyloids, even though they're forming outside of the neuron, they can also start to form inside blood vessels and start to cause problems with blood flow through the vessels. Also things like atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, even mini strokes that occur throughout the brain on a wide, frequent basis can cause negative effects in brain health. Cardiovascular problems, again, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, stroke, can damage blood vessels and reduce the flow of oxygen and nutrients to brain tissue, which results in this compounded damage and increased risk of vascular forms of dementia. Excuse me. So we can see that we're talking about Alzheimer's right now, but there are also vascular forms of dementia that can develop based, again, on the lack of nutrient delivery, lack of oxygen delivery, lack of waste product removal that occurs through this vascular damage that may happen. More vascular issues, obviously. Again, anything that leads to reduced blood flow or oxygen in the brain. As well, we didn't talk yet about the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, which is another issue that can also lead to the development of neuron death or Alzheimer's. So usually the blood-brain barrier forms between the brain and the rest of the body to keep bad things out of the brain. So it prevents harmful substances from getting into the brain while allowing things like glucose and other necessary molecules to get into the brain. So in a person with Alzheimer's, disruptions to the specialized transmitter proteins in the blood-brain barrier can stop glucose from reaching the brain and prevent prevent the proteins from being cleared away. So the beta proteins and the tau proteins that we talked about. Again, it's that whole combination of nutrients not getting into the brain and by waste products not getting removed from the brain. And this can result in inflammation. And the inflammation, again, worsens pretty much all pathological conditions, especially in the brain. So the inflammation starts to activate immune cells, which then start to rush into the brain and do all kinds of stuff that they release all kinds of chemicals and things that lead to tissue damage and neuron damage. So that accentuates the development of Alzheimer's. Now also, there are some genetic causes of Alzheimer's. Now, there are no specific single genes that are solely responsible for Alzheimer's disease that we know of yet. Now, multiple genes are likely involved. So one genetic risk factor which has been sort of identified is this APOE gene, which is on chromosome 19. And if you have that gene, it does increase your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, people who inherit one copy of APOE have an increased chance of developing the disease. Those who inherit two copies of the allele are at even greater risk. Now remember, each of us have two chromosomes, one from the mom, one from the dad. And on these chromosomes, there are areas that code for genes that are produced inside the body. So on a particular chromosome, you may have an area which is coding for a gene. And when we have areas on different genes that code, or when we have areas on the chromosomes that code for different genes, we call them alleles. And so basically, they're controlling the same trait. So when we have one copy, so one chromosome has one copy of one allele of this APO gene, you have an increased likelihood of developing Alzheimer's. When a gene has two copies, you have an even greater possibility of developing Alzheimer's. So this is the primary genetic discovery so far that is linked to Alzheimer's. So they're still investigating other genes and to see if there's an input or a likelihood if you have certain other combinations of deletions or malfunctioning genes, whether that contributes to the development of Alzheimer's. But for now, that's going to bring us to the end of our little introduction talk our overview talk on Alzheimer's. And we'll continue the series with other different types of dementia as we go, and we hope you join us for those. Thank you very much.